I had just come back from Afghanistan, and I took a tour in a buddy's car, and I said, man, I feel like I finally deserve something for the first time in my life. I'm always saving. And so I went out and got a new luxury Acura car. It was $25,000. And I essentially handed my wife off my old Toyota Camry. And she wasn't too fond of that.
You're listening to the Millionaires Unveiled podcast, where you'll hear the stories and interviews of everyday millionaires. We'll unveil their decisions, their strategies, and their current portfolio allocation. Now to your hosts, Clark Sheffield and Jace Mattinson.
Alrighty, welcome back, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Millionaires Unveiled podcast, episode 213. This is Clark here with my co-host, Jace. Jace, what's going on, man? Thanksgiving is a few days away. You got your brisket ready to go?
Yeah, got the brisket ready to go, man. I can't wait. Got some good sports on here shortly.
Save some for me, man, or mail it over.
Dude, you should come visit for Thanksgiving.
That would be fun.
Come play some turkey bowl, and we can go out to the lake too. We can still go out to the lake this time of year, man.
The one time a year that you play football.
Yeah, I play
turkey bowl.
Yeah, play the turkey bowl once a year. Kind of dust off the cleats, get out there, put my football gloves on.
Nice. Well, hey, let me just share a couple reviews we got on iTunes this week. So thanks to those who listen and share reviews. This one's from Casey Watt. He says, inspiring and informative. Such an intriguing podcast that either provides epiphanies or tasks to work on. There are different and many ways to reach millionaire status, and this podcast showcases examples from real people. Pick one. And then we got one from Timothy from Alabama. He says, I've really enjoyed listening to this podcast. It has provided great insight into a wide variety of folks who have achieved financial success. It has opened up my own perspective on how many different approaches are out there to take on my journey of financial freedom and success. Thanks for putting this together. So thanks to those who are listening and leaving reviews. We appreciate that. Just as a quick recap, last week we had Nick. He's an HR officer and National Guard, net worth of over $1 million, about 65% in real estate between his primary residence and a couple rentals. This week we have James, net worth over $1 million, and he works in IT. He has retirement accounts, brokerage accounts, and then obviously some home equity and a little bit of cash. So thanks again to James and Nick for coming on. If you'd like to ask a millionaire a question or ask us a question, go to our website, millionairesunveiled.com, hit Ask a Millionaire, and you can either write something in or record via SpeakPipe, and we'll talk about that like we did last week in one of the intros. So thanks again for tuning in with us, everybody. And without any further delay, please welcome James to the show.
James, you want to just give us a little about your background and what you're up to now?
Hey, my name is James. I'm 35 years old, and I've got a family with a 4 and a 2-year-old. So I'm staying pretty busy at home. In my professional life, I am an IT product manager at a Fortune 50 tech company.
Sweet, man. And what's your net worth today?
My net worth is $1.1 million.
Awesome. Newly minted millionaire not too long ago. So what's the breakup of the 1.1?
Yeah, the 1.1 I calculated earlier today to verify. It's 1% cash, so just over $10K in cash, and then 27% of that is in 401k through work. And I've been with the same employer since I started that 401k, so keeps it pretty easy to maintain. And then my wife is in education, so she's got a 403 and 457 that add up to 160k, so that's 15%. And then we have a couple 529s for our kids. We're trying not to overfund those, so currently they're only staying at 23,000, which is 2%. And then I dabbled a little bit in individual stocks, and I just have one remaining with Alibaba. So that represents 1% net worth. And then I have a great HSA through my employer, and that accounts for 3% of my net worth at $34,000. And my wife, being in education, also has a pension. She doesn't plan on staying at work until that pension fulfills, but she can withdraw it. So right now that's sitting at $40,000, which is 4%. And then we have two personal Roth IRAs that add up to 8% of our net worth with $87,000. And we invest those in REITs. And then lastly, our taxable brokerage through Vanguard is at $439,000, which is 40% of our net worth.
Wow. So you got things spread out pretty evenly. Where do you invest most of those retirement accounts and your brokerages? Is it stocks, or I guess you only mentioned you had one individual stock, but is it mutual funds or index funds or bonds, or what's the makeup there?
Yeah, everything besides the Alibaba is all passive index funds, low cost. They're all with either Vanguard or Fidelity.
And has it always been like that as you've started to build this net worth?
No, I had a very different strategy. So I took quite a bit of business classes in my undergrad, and I started studying individual stocks. And similar to Warren Buffett, I tried to stick with what I knew. So I knew that I was investing a lot of my personal time in looking at technology companies. So when I finished my undergrad, I really started looking at the Apples and Googles of the world. And I was a fairly early investor in Tesla back in 2013. And I'll tell you about that in a second, but it didn't pan out too well in retrospect. And I was also a psychological investor. So my undergrad at University of Michigan was in psychology. And I really saw a lot of these ups and downs were the result of emotions in psychology more than anything. So over those first few years of investing, I looked at emotional reactions from investors. For example, back in 2010, Toyota had an incident with brakes, with a brake recall, and it really pulled back on the stock numbers. And I kind of looked at that as like a quick win opportunity. There was a little bit of an oil issue with an oil leak in the same year that I tried to get into. So really I was playing individual stocks, but I kind of felt like I was at a Las Vegas casino, and I got a few quick wins and said, hey, this feels good. But for some reason at the foundation, I just feel uneasy. And what's interesting at the time, this was back in 2010 to 12-ish, I said, is there any kind of way that I can invest in more than one company? Because I don't feel like I have enough time to run all the fundamentals and do the actual technical analysis behind these. And I didn't know of the idea or the concept of index funds. And so later on, I at least found out about ETFs. And I said, okay, well, this at least lets me get into an industry. And so, I took some hypotheses about which industries might excel, like clean energy. And so I went into a couple of ETFs as my first step in my evolution. And then kind of rode that out for a while. And the tech stocks kept going up. So I held on to those through 2017. And then my brother, who is a year older, in 2018, he introduced me to a couple of podcasts about personal finance and early retirement. And the mantra there was really focused on low-cost passive index funds. And so he essentially gave me all these books, articles, all these forums and blogs, and essentially sold me on the idea of getting rid of all my individual stocks. So in 2018, I sold off all my individual stocks and moved into index funds. And at the same time, I really shifted my whole strategy to maximizing my tax advantaged accounts.
Interesting. And that's what I'm assuming that's what you're going to go do on a go forward basis as well.
Yeah, it really is. And that was one of my mistakes I was in the Air Force for 6 years, from 2007 to 2013. And they have a TSP account, and I just never understood it, to be honest with you. I knew that I needed to save up for grad school. I wanted to do my MBA 4 to 6 years after being in the military, and wanted to separate. And I didn't really understand the value add of tax advantaged accounts, to be honest with you, because I just knew that I needed to save up for tuition, or I thought I did at the time. And so I kept this huge safety net in taxable brokerage so that I had the liquidity available to me. And what I realized over time was just the ability to do tax deferred savings is much larger than I ever imagined. And I only got introduced to that when my brother pushed me into that community in 2018.
Interesting. And you have no real estate or equity in primary residence?
No, but that's the reason I got into REITs, because I wanted to be somewhat diversified, at least in real estate. And that looked like the easiest, most passive way to handle that. One of the reasons I had never gotten into real estate was I didn't have a mentor the way that I had a mentor with individual stocks and ETFs and eventually those index funds. Both my brothers who are older and have kind of always set the benchmark for me. Neither of them got into real estate income. And so I never really kind of had someone to follow the path of. And again, that was one of the biggest mistakes now that I look at in retrospect, because I was a young single 20-something-year-old living in San Antonio. And I had all the time in the world on my hands, kind of looking for a side hustle. And I had the flexibility coming out of undergrad that I was willing to live with just about as many people as I could to save money. And so the whole idea of house hacking, I just wasn't exposed to it from anyone. One of my buddies was doing it, but he lived with his he lived with a set of grandparents. And it almost felt like he was almost like taking care of them in an odd way. So it didn't appeal to me. And so I didn't have anyone to emulate myself from. As I got more entrenched into the communities, learned about podcasts like Bigger Pockets, then I started to realize how easily accessible this information has become. And so what I want to do in the future is start to delve more into real estate properties. And right now, it's a little hard trying to get enough information to find a good value on a property. Where I live, the 1% rule just doesn't seem to follow. And I want to be in an area where I feel like I have a little bit of insider advantage. And so I've got my eyes open a lot more than before, but I just haven't made that move yet.
So do you rent then, James?
No, we own, and that was more a stability move than anything else. Over my first 30 years, I moved 30 times, and that was mostly in the state of Michigan. A lot back and forth, but once I got into the Air Force, wow. I moved another 6 or so times across Texas, Colorado, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. I did a tour in Afghanistan, and then eventually came back to Austin for grad school, and then settled down here in the Austin area. So it was a lot of moves, and we decided to build our dream home at that point after floating across apartments. So it's not like it was breaking the bank during all those years. We were in low-cost apartments. We never lived in the downtown ritzy areas. So from that vantage point, it helped us save money, but not to the point of house hacking or even investing in real estate. Obviously, if you know anything about the Austin real estate market, if we had bought a property even and turned it into a real estate property during grad school in 2013 to 15, that would have probably close to doubled in value since then.
And when did you buy it? Just more recently?
Yeah, that was in 2015. So we're 5 years in, and we're choosing to go with the math over the psychology on this one. We have a 2.75% 30-year fixed loan. And by using a VA loan, we were able to only have to submit 5% for our down payment. And we had the choice to go more, obviously, and traditional being 20%. But in our initial loan, it was 3.625. But even at that point, it didn't seem like it made financial sense to put anything more than 5% in.
Gotcha. So let's back it up, James, a little bit here, and then we'll come back to the net worth and allocation a little bit and some of the financial decisions. But going back to when you joined the Air Force, how old were you and how come you decided to do that? Just curious to hear about your story here.
Yeah, that goes back a little bit further back in my roots. And I grew up pretty low socioeconomic. And after my parents, I'd say we were lower middle class. And then after my parents' divorce, it went quite a bit below that when I was 6 years old. So I lived in a single wide mobile home, and we went to the food banks, and we were able to go to private school, which was, a true blessing because they gave us a free tuition because of our situation. And they essentially told us, hey, as long as you continue to stay on the A honor roll and get good grades, we're gonna continue to help out here. And so I definitely grew up with a scarcity mindset. And the message I always got from my parents was there wasn't going to be anything for me once I got to my undergrad years. So once I hit 18, not only was I out of the house, but there wasn't going to be anything ready for me for undergrad. And so my two older brothers, being 8 and 1 year older than me, they went to the same university as me. And they took a different route by taking out a lot of student loans. And they just kind of accepted that's what life is a bunch of student loans, and then we'll go get a decent income in a good job, and then pay them off. It just seemed too scary for me to do that right off the onset. And so it was kind of a crazy coincidence that I went and visited the oldest brother once he got his first job out in San Diego, and all his roommates were Marines. And so I went out to the Marine base with them and went and got some food and went golfing. And I had a lot of military in my family, but they never sold me on the military or do anything about it. But once I had stepped foot on a military base, and he was an officer at the time, and he was a captain, and he sold me on all this good stuff and said, this might be a really great way for you to go. You can, instead of going enlisted, you could go in as an officer. You could still go to your dream school. Not only can you go, they'll pay for the whole thing for you. And that's really when I just put my foot on the gas and said, yeah, I've got to do whatever it takes to make this happen. And so every day that summer, I went and worked out and got ready for the physical training test. And I was gonna be a Marine. And then all my military family, cousins, aunts, uncles, they said, "Stop! What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean? I'm getting ready to go into the Marines." And they said, "No. We know you. We know your interests. Let's step back and get you into the Air Force route." And I said, "Okay, well, that's cool. I'll apply to both and see what happens." And thankfully, I got ROTC full ride scholarships for both Naval ROTC, which includes Marines, as well as Air Force. So at that point, I kind of got to pick my path and said, "All right, let's do this with the Air Force."
Wow, good for you. So they fully paid undergrad, and then what's the commitment after that?
Yeah, it's a really great deal. So it was initially a 4-year commitment, and not only did it include 100% of in-state tuition, and by the way, I went to the most expensive public school in the country, so they are willing to cover up to whatever the full asking amount is. But additionally, they provide a housing allowance, and they provide a stipend for books each semester. So really, it does take care of you. And then at the same time, it keeps you grounded because it's like having a part-time job with all the physical training and leadership classes and leadership labs that you have to go to. What was your...
Just following graduation, what's your commitment back to the Air Force?
Oh, yeah. And so it was 4 years. And then in a very great strike of luck, George Bush, right before he left office, he signed the 9/11 GI Bill. And what that said was that anyone that had participated post 9/11 in the military was eligible for this new 9/11 bill. Now, I wasn't initially eligible for the normal Montgomery GI Bill because I already got undergrad paid for. But what was great about this new program was that if you did any time post your commitment, your 4-year commitment, then they would also pay for grad school. So it's prorated. And ultimately, I chose to do 2 years after my initial commitment, so 6 years total, and that covered 80% of my tuition. And then if I had stayed one more year, they would have covered the full 100% of my MBA tuition. And the only reason
whatever you wanted to do and wherever you wanted to go.
Public school, yes, they cover the most expensive in-state public school. So for me, that was at University of Texas. And with private school, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit lower of a limit, but a lot of private schools have a program called a yellow ribbon in which they'll match the government contributions. And it makes it a little bit easier if you want to go into one of those top tier, more expensive private schools. And the only reason I didn't stay that 7th year to get 100% was simply because they told me that if I stayed that 7th year, they would move me again from Colorado to somewhere else. And I just didn't want to take on another move.
Right. So you did 6 years in the Air Force. Did they pay you at all for those 6 years, and how much?
Yeah, they definitely do, and it's all publicly available information if you look at the military pay charts. I think a lot of people have an ill-perceived conception of how much military earns because they don't take into consideration that base pay and monthly stipends are all tax-free. When I ran the numbers back in 2007, I felt like I was making roughly $50,000 a year. But as a lieutenant and then a young captain, it really exponentially rises in those first 8 to 10 years, your pay scale. And so in my 6th year, I calculated it as being somewhere between $100,000 and $105,000 if I were working on the outside in the private sector would be equivalent to.
Let's take a quick break. Today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp Online Therapy. Check them out at betterhelp.com/unveiled. One way to think about therapy is through a bunch of analogies. We get our cars tuned up to prevent bigger issues down the road. We get annual checkups and go to the gym to maintain physical wellness and prevent injury and disease. We do chores regularly, well, some of us, to avoid a giant mess of the house and roaches. Going to therapy is like all of these. It's routine maintenance for your mental and emotional wellness to prevent bigger issues down the road. BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and you can start communicating with your therapist in under 48 hours. Why invest in everything else and not your mind? This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp, and Millionaires Unveiled listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/unveiled. That's BetterHelp.com/unveiled.
So one thing I want to return to that you mentioned in your allocation was the $10K in cash. Is that just basically to pay your monthly living expenses, and you look at that brokerage account as more of, if I need to tap into it as an emergency fund, I can, or how do you go about thinking about, keeping such a small amount in cash?
Yeah, I used to keep a lot more. I used to be around $45,000, and it was for the reason you described. People had always told me, hey, you need 6 months, at least 3 months of emergency savings from your expenses. But I listened to a couple of podcasts and they said, what's the point of an emergency savings? And they said, how truly liquid does it need to be? And I knew that because I was saving up for grad school and had built up that big pool in my taxable brokerage, I had liquid money. It wasn't sitting in a retirement account that was much harder to access. So they said, do you really even need an emergency savings, or do you just need, as you said it, a revolving account for expenses? And that's how I looked at it. I have a pretty standard W-2 job. I know what my paycheck's going to be next month and the month after that. So if I just look at what my average credit card bill is per month, plus rent and whatnot, I can actually keep a lot lower than $12,500. That's a little high for me right now, but I plan on putting a little bit of that back into our Roth IRAs for 2021 calendar year. But for most of the last 2 years, I actually kept the cash around $4,000.
Interesting. So you bring up a good point. How does James go about allocating each one of his dollars? Let's just say, hey, I'm going to make, a dollar today or 10,000 or whatever you want to do in a given month or even, annualize it. How do you go about your investing strategy? Where do the dollars go first as it relates to your retirement accounts, brokerage accounts, HSA, 529s? How do you go about allocating everything?
Yeah, as I call it, the order of operations for my funding buckets. So I think it's going to change in the future, like I alluded to earlier. I would like to start thinking about how much to put on the side for a real estate opportunity. And but up until now, it's been fairly straightforward. The HSA is, I guess I should say the 401k match is the first bucket for me. And the reason is because I have a 6% employer match. And so that's free money. And then the next account is the HSA. There's a great article by Mad Scientist where HSA is described as triple tax advantage, and that there's no tax going in, no tax going out, and no tax for all the increases along the way. And so that really sold me on HSA. And the reason that I try to maximize that additionally is because you're able to take all your medical expenses, store those receipts for as long as you want, assuming that the tax law doesn't change, and then reimburse yourself, decades down the road. So every year I've been maxing that out, and then whatever medical bills I get, I've been paying out of pocket. And then the next account was my 401k, and that was with my current employer, and it just it was always the easiest thing to go to next and said, hey, I've got some really low cost, good index funds through Fidelity. So let me go max that out. And then, when we started learning about these different tax advantaged accounts, I knew that my wife had a pension available, but I didn't really know what a 403 or a 457 was until an episode of a podcast with a Millionaire educator. And he started talking about the value props behind the 403 and 457. And, my wife and I were on a road trip and we were listening to it and said, oh my gosh, what have we been doing? And my brother, who I mentioned earlier, was just about a couple months ahead of us, and his wife was also a teacher. And he said, this is great. My wife, her paycheck is $10. I said, what do you mean her paycheck is $10 and why are you happy about that? And he sent me a copy of her pay stub and just showed all of those tax advantage deductions that she had. And between having a fairly low educator salary minus the 403 max out, minus the 457 max out, he said, James, you've really got a situation here that you can, I don't want to say exploit, because exploit sounds like a bad thing, but to take advantage of, because you're a high income earner. She's a low income earner, but she has these special accounts at her disposal with the 403, 457. You need to get in there. And so I quickly followed suit and try to maximize those as much as possible. And I got about one and a half accounts maxed out. And then I was able to get some pay increases through work. And then for the 2020 calendar year, actually 2019 calendar year, was the first year that we could max that out. Did it again in 2020. I think she had somewhere around like $5,000 of taxable income at the end of the year. So it was a pretty awesome situation to be in. So that was the 401k match, HSA, 401, 403, 457. And then this last year, we still had some left over after that. So that's when we dipped into the 529s, and we put $8,000 per child there this last year. And you can go up to $14,000 per year per kid. And so we might take that a little bit higher next year, but what we're striving for is to hit about 50% of their estimated expenses. And the reason for that is because so much is going to change in the educational sector by the time that they get there, get to college in 15 years. And I just don't want to overinvest or overfund those accounts if something changes in the whole education paradigm.
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting point as it relates to those 529s. Going forward, what would you do with them? Let's just say if your kids chose an alternative route, or have you thought through that, or what might happen, as education changes, and basically, do you continue to? At this point, right? You've allocated X amount of dollars in there. How do you go about thinking about that? Obviously you've kind of said, hey, maybe we'll tone this down or shut this off, but how do you go about thinking about that, for the future for them and what my potential financial situation with those accounts?
Yeah, that's a great question. The last couple of years, I hadn't invested for the 529 because I was scared of that 10%, the 10% fee that they charge if you withdraw it for non-educational expenses. But then I went and did a little bit of research and tried to find why other people were still continuing to invest in 529s. Well, some people are doing it because they live in states where there's a tax advantage for income tax. But being in Texas, I don't get that advantage. But some other points that were brought up are that education has a fairly loose definition. So it might not be your traditional 4-year school, but it could still be a trade school. So that's one way it could potentially go. Second is that it doesn't necessarily have to go to your kids. You can reassign it to your grandkids, or you can even assign it to your spouse if they decide to go back to school, or even if you both want to go back to school, you and your partner, and do something really off the cuff like a culinary institute. There's so many different ways to apply these funds. And at the end of the day, the worst case scenario is that you do ultimately pay a 10% fee and just withdraw it for personal use. But if you're in that situation and you don't have anything else to use it on, and by that point, I should be well past my fine number, then, it's not going to make or break my whole situation. So I just saw that there were enough outs, as I would describe it. There were enough outs that I could use it in other places that I wasn't too concerned.
Yeah, totally. So you bring up your FI number. One question we like to ask our millionaires is where do you go? I mean, what does the future hold? Are you trying to get to a certain net worth, or is it passive income, or how do you go about thinking about what that FI number looks like and what your lifestyle looks like or changes over time here as you continue to grow your wealth?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing I'm afraid of is lifestyle creep, because right now, looking in the forefront, it looks like an easy path. Right now, my number looks like 3 million in investments, but 3 million investments minus $300,000 in my home payoff by the time I expect to be FI, minus 100K per child for education. So that would put me at 2.5 million in investments. With a 4% safe withdrawal rate, gives me $100,000 in annual expenses. I know a huge unknown and something that hasn't been solved for within the fire community is healthcare costs. So I'm trying to be really conservative about how much those might go up, along with education. Those are the two categories that have the highest inflation rates in our country. So I do want to be cognizant of that. But assuming that our home is paid off and that we're close to, if not empty nested by that point, we have such low annual, we would have such low annual expenses by then that $100,000 would be way more than we need in any given year. But I need to loosen up a little bit from where I have been. I don't want to spend hours saving $10 on an airplane ticket. I don't want to go fish for coupons every time we're trying to decide where to go to dinner. But I think $100,000 would more than suffice to get a golf membership and do the other things I want to do, because I just don't enjoy some of those things that other people consider more extravagant.
So how much do you spend a year now?
Right now, it's actually $8,000 per year, which might sound like a lot. That's looking at $96,000 in expenses per year.
8,600 a month. 8K a month.
Yeah, it's a lot more than probably most people are used to spending. The reason it's so high though is because we did only put 5% down on our house, and it was initially a $430,000 house. So our mortgage was, remaining still was around $400K. And then in Texas, although we don't have income tax, we have high property tax. So our property tax is 3%. So that was $12,000 a year just in property tax. So combine that together, you're looking at around $3,000 per month. We've got 2 kids in childcare at $1,000 a month. So that's another $2,000. So now you're up to $5,000 just between those two things that are going to go away, once we're at that FI stage. And then looking at $250 a month for my wife's student loans. And the good news there is that being in education, she's eligible for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, the PSLF, as they call it. So what that requires is 10 years of public service, or I should say 120 qualifying payments. And so in the same way that I did public service to get that scholarship and get grad school paid for, she saw that 10-year commitment to public service being her way to get out of education loans. When she finished undergrad and her grad school, she was at $75,000 with student loans, and she's currently at $57,000 in student loans. So in 5 short months from now, that whole balance will be forgiven. So that'll not only will that $57,000 be forgiven, but that'll also free up another $250 in expenses per month.
Wow.
And then kind of the last big ticket item in those expenses is just over $600 in a car payment per month. And I can imagine people reacting to this podcast saying, oh my God, how do they spend that much? But it was really straightforward, actually. So I bought a 2003 Toyota Camry in 2007, the prototypical 3-year used car at $10,000, and it was the perfect thing for me and stayed stable. Well, my wife bought a Lemon, and a little later down the road, and essentially we just had to unload it and try to figure out a new way to go. And I had just come back from Afghanistan, and I took a tour in a buddy's car, and I said, man, I feel like I finally deserve something for the first time in my life. I'm always saving. And so I went out and got a new luxury Acura car. It was $25,000. and I essentially handed my wife off my old Toyota Camry, and she wasn't too fond of that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it had 100,000 miles on it. I said, no, this thing is good. I've been taking care of it. It's good for at least another $150,000 more. I'm like, it's not my fault that you bought the lemon. So, you're just gonna have to suck it up. Well, once we had kids, it was a little harder to keep that story. And she moved so many times for me and for my career to advance. And so what we agreed on was getting a brand new Honda Pilot. It was 2017 at the time. And so it was a 5-year loan. And the reason that we still owe on it $14,000 is because we were able to get it at a 0.9% interest rate. So similar to the house, there was no reason to pay that off early. And the agreement we made, we'll see if she holds to it, was that she would keep that vehicle for 20 years. So even though it was new, we did look at used Honda Pilots a few years old. But when we did the math, it really was not that different. Hondas and Toyotas hold their residual value really well. And so when we compared the 3-year model to the brand new, it was, almost identical. And if you take into consideration maintenance fees and whatnot, it was almost more advantageous if you do good negotiation on new vehicles to go that route. So we went in December when they were doing their end of year and trying to clear inventory, and we realized that they have 5 trim levels, and one of the trim levels was grossly overbought by a lot of the local dealers, and they were trying to unload them. And so it was able to help us get $6,000 or $7,000 below sticker price. And so net, hopefully she'll have that car for 17 more years, and that's that.
17 more years. Nice. Well, thanks, Craig, for sharing. Let me just jump into some rapid fire questions here, and then we'll wrap it up. So what's been the most expensive pair of pants you've ever purchased?
Pair of pants, I'm going to go $40. I don't know if it was a pair of khakis or a pair of jeans, but that $45 is kind of my threshold.
Okay. What about the most expensive meal out?
That was just last month when we hit $1 million. So it was celebratory not only for that, but also it was our 10-year anniversary, and in the same week. So we went out to Brazilian Steakhouse, and that was $140. And we try to do Brazilian Steakhouse about once every 2 years, and for key events.
Yeah. How old were you when you became a millionaire?
35.
35. Okay. Awesome. What items or experiences are worth spending more money on to you?
That's a hard one. My wife would probably say I don't want to spend on anything for anyone. I would say visiting family and friends has been pretty worthwhile. I'm always willing to throw in to try to go to San Jose or back to Michigan to visit close friends and family, and those are some of my greatest memories. Once every few years, a big trip outside the U.S. Does really well. I've really liked the exposure to Europe and other places.
Okay. Have you ever used a financial advisor?
I have not. Like I said, I dabbled in the individual stocks and kind of felt like I was getting a little lucky. And the next step was the passive index funds, and just let it ride.
Yeah. As much as you're comfortable sharing here, what's been your range of annual household income since you've been working?
So, with the military, like I said, I started around $50,000, and I'm currently at a total compensation of $205,000 now. And then my wife is at $65,000. So combined, pre-tax, we're at $270,000. But because we are able to invest in so many of those tax managed accounts, we're able to keep quite a bit of that, thankfully.
Good for you guys, man. You're crushing it. Way to go.
Yeah, thank you.
Any specific financial goal, either net worth or passive income?
So I've always tried to play my life one goal at a time. It was getting into my dream college, then getting into my dream MBA program, and getting the ROTC scholarship. So really my next dream is just to hit my basic FI number of $3 million in investments. And I hope to do that in assuming that the market stays healthy. I don't expect as good of returns, obviously, but hopefully in 8 years we can hit the FI number. But I think there is going to be a little bit of lifestyle creep, and I think I will want to adjust my number a little bit. People have tried to set the expectation that once my kids are a little older and they're in high school, they're not going to want to hang out with me nearly as often as they do right now. And B, it's a little bit harder to live nomadically or live more of a freestyle life when you've got kids still in school that need to finish up. So my wife always warns me that I'm a workaholic and I'll continue to want to be at least until they empty nest. So if that happens, I project that we should be able to get up to 6 million or so. We're kind of in inertia mode at this point. All those numbers assume that, for example, I never get promoted again or get another income raise or anything like that. So if any of those things happen, it'll be icing on the cake. But even without all that, just using the rules 72, we should be sitting at least at 5 million by the time we call it quits.
Yeah, good for you. So just in closing here, what's your final mistake, any mistakes you've made, or your final advice to somebody if they're you, maybe they're in the military, maybe they're not, if they're just starting out, just saving, maybe they're in their MBA program, what would be your final words of advice to them?
I made so many mistakes along the way. I mean, there were good things I did. For example, in Afghanistan, I was able to get somewhere around a 99% savings rate just by moving out of my house and unloading my car and everything while I was deployed. But on the reverse side, I didn't invest in my TSP the entire time I was in the military because I thought it was only a value prop if they did a match. And they did up to a 2% match for civilians. So missing out on TSP was a big thing. Number two is that I had some huge gains from those tech companies in the early 2010s. And I felt overwhelmed with the incoming tax burden. So I actually sold off like pretty much all of my capital gains in a year because I thought my income would be lower going into grad school. And ultimately, I think I ended up paying some kind of penalty fee for having too much income that year. And I could have easily deferred and held on to that stock. Something else that happened was just not hacking real estate at any point or getting into real estate during all those years. And then a couple speculative bets. So with the companies that I knew a little bit about within the technology sector, I actually did quite well on those picks. But there were some pure speculative bets that I did on crypto in 2018. I bought it $12,000 and made a quick 50% return within a few weeks and said, man, life is great. And then it shot all the way down to $3,000. And my brother convinced me I need to get into index funds. So I took a 75% loss. On another note, I was told to get into precious metals and I should try to diversify. And I said, hey, this palladium, I think it's going to get a lot more culturally popular. And hey, this thing has so many ups and down swings. Let me just ride it for one more swing and then take a 25% gain. And it turns out the point that I bought, they actually went bankrupt. The company went bankrupt. And so I lost around 90% of that investment, which was $15,000. And I've kind of always said up to $15,000 was kind of play money. And so when I invested in crypto, I said the same thing. Hey, if I lose all this, I'm not going to be heartbroken or anything. But the two bets that I made that were purely speculative really blew up in my face.
What's the crypto out now? It hasn't gone up?
Yeah, it has. After my brother convinced me to get out, and that was another mistake was during my grad school, I invested in Tesla. This was before the split. I bought at $100 a share, and I sold in 2018 at $343 a share. So I think it was a 4-to-1 split or 5-to-1 split, and it was at like high 700s per share. So 7 times 420. That's about $3,000 a share equivalent. So yeah, I could have had another 10x growth in the last 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah, but coulda, shoulda, woulda. On the flip side of that, in March when we had the 30% dip in the whole market, I was able to sleep fine. And all my coworkers who I do financial classes at work for all my coworkers, I'm retiring early. And they said, Craig, what do I do? And I said, I don't know. I'm sleeping fine. I'm in index funds. I'm not in individual stock picking anymore. And so for me, it's easy to sleep at night knowing that I'm not making speculative bets. And in a random walk down Wall Street, they talk about the greater fool phenomenon and that someone's always going to pay more than you're willing to get in, and just being out of that whole game just made it a lot easier to ride that dip and buy during the dip instead of, get scared and worry each day what you're going to do.
Yeah, totally. Well, thanks, James, for sharing so much. Thanks for being so open. Appreciate your candor. And obviously, thanks for your service as well. So again, just to recap, it's James' net worth of $1.1 million. Thanks again for coming on tonight.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, James.
Thanks for listening to the Millionaires Unveiled podcast with Clark Sheffield and Chase Mattinson. For more stories, investment opportunities, and information, check out our website at millionairesunveiled.com. See you next time when you'll hear from another everyday millionaire.